At 1:23 in the morning on the 26th of April, 1986, Reactor Number 4 at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant ceased to exist. Not damaged, not crippled, erased. In 4 seconds, the reactor produced power roughly 10 times greater than what it was designed to handle in its entire operating lifetime. The roof, a steel and concrete disc weighing 1,000 tons, was blown into the air. Chunks of radioactive graphite landed on the surrounding grounds. Fires ignited across 7 separate locations. 2 men died within minutes. 28 more would be dead within 3 months. In the city of Pripyat, 3 kilometers away, 49,000 people were asleep. They had not been warned. They would not be warned for another 36 hours. This is the story of how that happened. And more importantly, why a system that was supposed to prevent exactly this outcome was, instead, the reason it occurred. To understand what happened inside that building, you need to understand what kind of reactor was inside it. The RBMK was a Soviet design, built from the 1960s onward. It ran on slightly enriched uranium, it was cooled by water, and it was moderated, meaning its chain reaction was controlled by solid blocks of graphite. That combination made it cheap to build, easy to scale, and capable of being refueled while still running. For a country that needed enormous amounts of electricity and, quietly, a reactor that could produce weapons-grade plutonium as a byproduct, the RBMK was exactly what the system required. It also had a characteristic that most reactor designs in the world were specifically built to avoid. When the water inside an RBMK began to boil, producing steam bubbles, which engineers call voids, the reactor did not slow down. It sped up. More steam meant less water, and water in this design absorbed neutrons. Less absorption meant more fission. More fission meant more heat. More heat meant more steam. The cycle fed itself. Engineers call this a positive void coefficient. What it means, in plain terms, is that under certain conditions, the reactor's own instability became its accelerant. There was a second flaw. The control rods used to slow the reactor down had tips made of graphite, the same material that speeds the reaction up. For the first 2 to 3 seconds after a control rod entered the core, it briefly increased reactivity before the absorbing section could take effect. The Soviet engineers who built the RBMK knew it had unusual behavior at low power. That knowledge existed. What happened to it is the second part of this story. Every nuclear plant needs emergency cooling. If the main power supply fails, pumps must keep water moving through the reactor core until backup diesel generators come online. Those generators take between 60 and 75 seconds to reach full power. The question Chernobyl's engineers needed to answer was this. During those 60 to 75 seconds, could the momentum of a coasting turbine, one already spinning down from normal operation, generate enough electricity to keep the cooling pumps running? It was a reasonable question, a necessary one. The test designed to answer it had been attempted 3 times already. In 1982, the turbine voltage proved insufficient. In 1984, an improved electrical system was tested, and again failed to meet requirements. In 1985, a recording equipment fault made the results unusable. Each attempt produced paperwork. None produced a verified answer. Anatoly Dyatlov was the deputy chief engineer responsible for conducting the 1986 attempt. He was experienced, technically confident, and operating inside a system that measured success by completion. Unfinished tests did not advance careers. Delayed procedures attracted scrutiny from Moscow. Dyatlov did not invent that pressure. He had simply worked inside it long enough that its logic had become his own. He believed the test was straightforward. He believed the reactor was manageable. He was not a reckless man. He was a man whose confidence had never yet been wrong enough to cost him anything. The test was scheduled for the day shift on the 25th of April. At 1 in the afternoon, with the reactor already powered down to 50% and the crew prepared, the regional electricity grid dispatcher in Kyiv made a request. Power demand across the grid was higher than expected. Reactor number 4 could not be taken offline yet. Hold the shutdown. Hold the test. They held it for 9 hours. That delay did not change the procedure on paper. What it changed was who would carry it out. At midnight, the day shift ended. The crew that had spent the entire day preparing for the test, briefed, ready, familiar with every step of what was about to happen, went home. The night shift took their seats. Among them was Leonid Toptunov. He was 26 years old. Senior Reactor Control Engineer was his title. Running a test of this complexity on a reactor in this condition was beyond anything he had done before. He had held his position for roughly 3 months. Toptunov was not careless. He was not unqualified on paper. He was simply young, newly placed, and now responsible for the most consequential phase of a procedure he had not been present to prepare for. Nobody pulled him aside. Nobody suggested the night shift was the wrong crew for this moment. The procedure was handed over. The test would continue. By midnight, the day shift was gone. The crew now responsible for the test had not been part of its preparation. They were handed a procedure and told to continue. At 12:28 in the morning on the 26th of April, Leonid Toptunov made a mistake. He was transferring reactor control from one regulation system to another, a routine step in the procedure. In the transition, he lost his grip on the power level. The reactor, already running in an unstable low-power state, began to drop, not slowly. Within 30 seconds, output fell from the target of 700 megawatts to 30 megawatts, a level so low the reactor was barely distinguishable from off. Part of what drove it there was the reactor itself. After 9 hours of reduced power, the core had accumulated xenon, a byproduct of the fission process that absorbs neutrons and suppresses the chain reaction. It is called xenon poisoning. Think of it as the reactor becoming increasingly resistant to being controlled. The longer the delay had run, the deeper that resistance had built. To recover power, Toptunov and Akimov began withdrawing control rods from the core. The rods, when inserted, absorb neutrons and slow the reaction. Pulling them out does the opposite. One by one, then in groups, the rods came out. The procedure required a minimum of 15 rods to remain inserted at all times as a safety buffer. By 1 in the morning, when the reactor finally stabilized, the number remaining inside the core was somewhere between 6 and 8. Those missing rods were not an alarm that rang. They were a condition that existed silently while the crew prepared to begin the test. They stabilized at 200 megawatts. The procedure required 700. Dyatlov ordered the test to proceed. That decision was the point of no return. At 1:20 in the morning, the test began. 4 additional coolant pumps were activated to simulate the conditions the turbine would face during a real power failure. 8 pumps now running simultaneously. More water flowing into the core than the reactor, at 200 megawatts, was generating enough heat to manage. The water did not boil. It passed through the core still largely liquid, and cold, dense water absorbs neutrons. Power dropped further. The reactor was now operating below even the 200 megawatt floor they had already compromised on. The operators made small adjustments, more control rods withdrawn, trying to hold the level steady. At 1:23 and 4 seconds, the turbine steam valve was closed. The test was officially running. The turbine began to spin down. The pumps it was powering began to slow. Slower pumps meant less coolant flow. Less flow meant the water already in the core had more time to heat. It began to boil. Steam bubbles formed where liquid water had been. And now the reactor's hidden design took over. More steam, less neutron absorption, more fission, more heat, more steam. The feedback loop described in an earlier section, the one the engineers had documented and filed and not corrected, was now running inside a core with almost no control rods left to stop it. At 1:23 and 40 seconds, an operator named Alexander Toptunov, a different man from Leonid at a different panel, reported the power readings to Dyatlov. The numbers were rising, fast. Dyatlov gave the order to shut down. At 1:23 and 46 seconds, Shift Foreman Alexander Akimov pressed the AS5 button. The emergency shutdown. Every control rod in the reactor would now descend simultaneously into the core. Each rod had a graphite tip. 200 graphite tips entered the core at once. For 2 to 3 seconds, every one of them accelerated the reaction before the absorbing section could reach it. Power did not fall. It surged. They pressed the emergency shutdown button to stop the reactor. That button started the explosion. The power surge ruptured fuel channels throughout the core. Fuel fragments, still at fission temperatures, made direct contact with the coolant water. The water flashed instantly to steam. Pressure inside the reactor vessel climbed beyond any value the structure was designed to contain. At 1:23 and 58 seconds, the first explosion occurred. It was a steam explosion. Not a nuclear detonation. Nuclear power plants are physically incapable of producing one. But the energy released in those seconds was sufficient to lift the reactor's upper biological shield, a steel and concrete assembly weighing 1,000 tons, vertically out of its housing. It came to rest at an angle, partially covering the open shaft where the reactor core had been. 2 to 3 seconds later, a second explosion followed. Its precise cause remains a subject of scientific discussion. The most widely accepted explanation involves a rapid buildup of hydrogen gas generated by the interaction of steam with the zirconium cladding on the fuel rods, igniting in the presence of air that had entered the breached vessel. The combined force of both explosions destroyed the upper structure of the reactor building. Chunks of graphite from the moderator, intensely radioactive, were ejected onto the surrounding roof and grounds. Some landed as far as the turbine hall. Fires ignited in 7 separate locations across the facility. The roof of the adjacent machine hall caught alight within minutes. What remained of the reactor core was open to the sky. Graphite blocks were burning. Radioactive material was already entering the atmosphere. In the control room, Shift Supervisor Alexander Akimov gave the order that would haunt him until his death 6 weeks later. Keep pumping water into the reactor. Akimov believed the reactor was intact. This was not denial in the ordinary sense. It was the product of a lifetime working inside a system that had told him, repeatedly and through every training document he had ever read, that what had just happened was not possible. The reactor could not be destroyed. Therefore, it had not been destroyed. Therefore, the problem was something else. A ruptured pipe, a partial failure, something that more cooling water would address. Dyatlov walked through the facility and saw graphite on the ground. He was told it was graphite. He concluded it had come from somewhere else. Acting on Akimov's orders, operators were sent into the building to manually lower control rods into a reactor core that no longer existed. They descended into corridors filling with invisible contamination. Several received radiation doses that would kill them within weeks. They came back and reported what they found. The reports were not believed. At 1:28 in the morning, the first fire crews arrived. They had been told it was a roof fire. They climbed onto the structure in standard gear, without dosimeters, without respiratory protection. Some of them picked up pieces of reactor core material with their bare hands, not knowing what it was. One firefighter later recalled that the air tasted of metal. Another described a sensation of warmth spreading across his face within minutes of arrival. This is what the design flaw made possible. Not just the explosion, but the hours after it, in which men moved through lethal conditions because nothing in their experience had prepared them to recognize what those conditions were. Leonid Toptanov, the 26-year-old at the control panel when the power collapsed, was among those who remained at the plant through the early morning hours. He died on the 11th of May, 1986. He was 26 years old. While men died trying to cool a reactor that no longer existed, 49,000 people 3 kilometers away were sleeping. No alarm had been raised. No announcement had been made. On the morning of the 26th of April, Pripyat woke up normally. The city had been built specifically to house the plant's workforce and their families. It was, by Soviet standards, a privileged place to live, well-supplied, well-maintained, young. The average age of its 49,000 residents was 26. There was a fairground under construction, scheduled to open 4 days later for the May Day celebrations. On the morning after the explosion, children went outside to play. A wedding took place. People walked to work, to school, to the market. The sky was clear. The air, to anyone without measuring equipment, was indistinguishable from any other spring morning. The radioactive plume rising from the open reactor core 3 kilometers away was invisible, odorless, and already moving across the city. Soviet officials knew by early morning that the situation was serious. The decision to evacuate, however, could not be made locally. It required authorization from Moscow. Phone calls were made up a chain of command in which each person who had the authority to approve an evacuation also had a professional interest in not being the person who ordered one. Hours passed. The calls continued. Below, in the city, the morning became afternoon. The evacuation announcement came at 2 in the afternoon on the 27th of April, 36 hours after the explosion. It was read over loudspeakers across the city. Residents were told the evacuation was temporary. They should take documents, essential belongings, food for a few days. They would be back within 3 days, the announcement said. Please keep calm. The decision that cost those 36 hours was not made by one person. It was produced by a system in which the consequences of inaction were invisible, and the consequences of action were immediate and career-ending. That calculation is not unique to the Soviet Union. It is not unique to 1986. They left the lights on. They left food on tables. They closed their windows as instructed. Most of them never went back. The radioactive plume from Reactor Number 4 drifted northwest. It crossed Ukraine. It crossed Belarus. It moved over Poland, Sweden, Finland, and into Central Europe. Most of the people beneath it did not know it was there. The Soviet government had not issued a public statement. Internal communications described the situation as contained. The word Chernobyl had not yet appeared in any Western news report. On the morning of the 28th of April, a worker arriving at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden walked through a routine radiation checkpoint. The alarm triggered. He had not yet entered the facility. He had come from outside. His shoes were radioactive. The plant initiated an emergency protocol. Engineers checked their own reactors for leaks. They found none. They checked again. Still none. The contamination was not coming from inside Forsmark. It was coming from the air, from somewhere to the east. Swedish authorities pressed Moscow for an explanation. That evening, Soviet state television broadcast a 4-sentence statement. There had been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power station. Measures were being taken. The situation was under control. The plume at that moment was still moving. The information that could have prompted protective action, staying indoors, avoiding fresh produce, giving iodine tablets to children to protect their thyroid glands, was withheld for days in the affected regions and for weeks in cities like Kiev, 80 miles to the south. The health consequences of that delay cannot be precisely quantified. They also cannot be separated from the delay itself. Information withheld during a crisis does not stay neutral. It becomes part of the damage. In the days and weeks after the explosion, the Soviet state mobilized on a scale that had no modern precedent. Helicopters flew thousands of sorties over the open reactor, dropping sand, lead, clay, and boron in an attempt to smother the burning graphite and reduce the radiation escaping into the atmosphere. Engineers were sent to drain a flooded basement beneath the reactor, a pool of water that, if the molten core reached it, risked producing a second steam explosion. 3 men volunteered to wade through radioactive water in darkness to open the drainage valves. They succeeded. Their names were Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov. The sarcophagus, a steel and concrete structure built to enclose the entire destroyed reactor, was completed in 206 days. The men who built it worked in shifts measured in minutes, not hours, because the radiation fields on the roof would reach a lethal dose faster than a normal working day. They are collectively called the liquidators. Across the full cleanup operation, their number reached 600,000. The confirmed death toll directly attributable to the accident stands at 31 in the immediate aftermath, 2 from the explosion itself, and 29 from radiation exposure in the weeks that followed. The longer-term picture is genuinely contested and should be stated as such. Approximately 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer occurred in the affected populations, predominantly in people who were children at the time of exposure. The United Nations projects up to 4,000 eventual premature deaths from radiation-related illness across the most affected regions. Other estimates are higher. The honest answer is that the full count is not yet final. Valery Legasov led the Soviet scientific delegation to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna in August 1986. He presented a detailed account of the accident, more candid than his government intended. He spent the following 2 years attempting to force structural reforms to Soviet nuclear safety culture. He was resisted at every level. On the 2nd anniversary of the explosion, the 26th of April 1988, he took his own life. He left behind audio recordings. In them he said, "When one looks at the chain of events, it is impossible to find a single culprit, a single initiator. It was like a closed circle." He was right. And that is the point. The RBMK reactor's positive void coefficient was corrected after Chernobyl. The graphite-tipped control rod design was corrected. International nuclear safety standards were overhauled. The Soviet culture of institutional secrecy that made all of it possible did not survive the decade. The Soviet Union itself did not survive the decade. Historians continue to debate how much Chernobyl accelerated its end. The exclusion zone around the plant covers approximately 2,600 square kilometers. It remains in place today. Nature has largely reclaimed it. Forests have grown over roads, animals have returned in numbers not seen for generations. The reactor itself sits beneath its new steel arch, completed in November 2016, designed to last 100 years. Beneath the arch, inside the original sarcophagus, an estimated 200 tons of nuclear fuel remain. The chain that produced the explosion on the 26th of April, 1986, began not with a test, not with a delay, not with a power collapse, and not with a button. It began with a design that was known to be dangerous, in a system that had decided the danger was acceptable, inside an institution that had no mechanism for anyone to say otherwise out loud. That is not a description of a different time and a different country. It is a description of what happens when the people who understand a risk are not the people who decide what to do about it. Remember Chernobyl, not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it revealed. That a system can be designed to hide its own danger and keep hiding it until the moment it cannot.